Ukrainian checked the snow-covered remains and fragments scattered throughout the trench. The cold wind whistled sharply in his ears, reddening his face and freezing his extremities. The snow that had melted on his uniform during the warmer moments of the battle was now starting to freeze, giving up more and more of his precious body heat to the environment. The trench seemed abandoned, the Russians defeated in that region of the Vuhledar front in southern Ukraine. For a brief moment, the man in front almost relaxed, but the others noticed the slight movement ahead. The Russian moved quickly, but the Ukrainian rifles from the rest of the squad were ready. The 7.62mm rounds defied the cold winds to finally steal what was left of the Russian warmth in that trench. The first months of the Ukraine war were filled with disbelief. Russian might advanced over a country that had given up its atomic bombs and had almost its entire military doctrine based precisely on the army that was now invading. The world watched, just waiting to see how long it would take for the entire nation to fall. No one believed that a much smaller state could resist the advance of one of the world's greatest military powers. But the Ukrainians stood firm despite successive defeats and massacres. Gradually, help arrived in various forms. Weapons came from other countries, but human resources also came on their own. Men from various nations joined the Ukrainians in fighting the Russians. The International Legion had been formed when fighters from several countries began landing in Poland and other locations, then heading to the conflict zone. The legionnaires were part of the official Ukrainian army. The Maori Kaintetai was one of them. Born in New Zealand, he went through Afghanistan, facing the harshness of combat in the heat of the valleys and the cold in the mountains. He survived improvised explosives and sudden shots from snipers. When he arrived in Ukraine, he found another kind of war, where fire rained from the sky and death plowed the fields to plant the bodies of men from any nation. Kirintitai, codenamed Turtle, commanded a platoon with such mixed nationalities that instructions were relayed in a chain: Portuguese to Spanish, Spanish to English, English to Ukrainian. There were so many at the beginning that the New Zealander looked around and wondered how they would work together. The battlefield had filled up with out-of-shape former police officers, gun fanatics, and war romantics. Little by little, terror filtered them out. Men learned the need to march for kilometers or run under bombardment. Others saw that their targets shot back, often with incendiary ammunition. And the romance some had with war ended in an irreconcilable divorce when they discovered that the Reaper is a lover that war will never abandon. Turtle moved to the Vuledar region with the platoon in the first months of battle. The intense Russian shelling was falling on Pavlivka, a city further south, when they began reconnaissance of the region. Two other New Zealanders had joined them, Ty and Dominic Ablin. A German with the codename Tequil and the American Joshua Jones also took part in the reconnaissance missions. Of course, the Legion was subordinated to a brigade, allowing Turtle to have contact with and fight alongside Ukrainians, like Oleksiy, with whom he had trained mainly for raids and close quarters battle. The foreign Reconnaissance platoon took part in important missions. It was the beginning of autumn, when the leaves were falling and the vegetation stopped being one of the main protections for advances, when they started moving through the terrain around Pavlivka. They looked back where, In Vuledar, the troops of the 72nd and 53rd Ukrainian Mechanized Brigades were preparing for combat. The American Herring, with 5 years of experience in the American Armed Forces, was walking alongside Turtle, following the orders of the New Zealander. He was the one who made the drones fly. His eyes fixed on the screen watched the Russians walking through the trenches. He also knew how to turn those little flying machines into weapons for a swift and precise drop on Russian hideouts. Smoke was the only thing seen from up there when the grenade fragments sank into the enemy bodies. Occasionally, they would just go to advanced positions with the intention of launching a drone and observing. Turtle planned the mission and they marched in the dead of night, trying to avoid Russian observers. When the drone flew, they marked the positions well, even seeing when tanks advanced. The global positioning system was a valuable ally to indicate where to shoot. Little by little, tanks and BMPs exploded, slowing down the Russians' desire to take Vuledar. Even so, the adversaries persisted. As a rule of war, staying on the defensive was not enough, and the Ukrainians decided to counterattack. Herring and Turtle checked the enemy trench. Each trench was mapped out, and the men were counted to prepare for an attack. Back at the base, Turtle joined the others for planning. The warlord settled among them, observing the confidence in the soldiers' plan. He laughed at fate and at the fates, the women who manipulated the loom of life and with their scissors cut the thread that marked the existence of men on earth. The Lord of War was indeed a sadistic comedian who reinterpreted men's plans for his own perverse satisfaction in the soldiers' despair. It was night when Turtle and his men began their advance. The planning was complete, the trench was mapped out. Now they just had to wait for the transport that would take them into combat. The wrong pilot showed up to pick them up, having trouble taking the troops in the right direction. The Russians ended up detecting them, and the artillery began its programmed countdown of bombs, waking souls in the night with explosions. Lost in the middle of so many impacts, they were forced to disembark and continue on foot through the line of trees. Turtle was walking focused with the American Joshua Jones and the New Zealander Ablen in front. Behind him, Ty was coming with the PKM loaded to provide cover. The first shots came from the middle of the darkness. Their shapes were detected by the Ukrainians' thermal vision. The shots went past them, making them duck with their hands on their radios. Turtle tried to communicate, but the Russians were definitely already blocking the contact. Silence returned to the night after they stood still for a long time. The muteness of the darkness was only interrupted by the impact of mortars digging into the ground in the distance. Turtle stopped in the middle of the walk, telling Ty to set up the PKM at the point for cover. Ablin touched his shoulder, saying that now each one would go their own way. The two New Zealanders greeted each other, wishing each other luck, knowing that the fates always have sharp scissors pointed at the lifeline of men. Turtle was Maori and had already told Ablin that his body was just a shell, and if he fell, they shouldn't worry about retrieving him. Joshua Jones and other Americans were moving along with Ablin, the German to kill, and other members of the platoon. The night still protected them, but it was already 5 in the morning, and the delays had left them with little time under the cover of darkness. They passed among the twisted trees, their clothes catching on broken branches. So many shapes in the night seemed like little hauntings of fallen souls trying to stop them. The first trenches appeared just ahead. Ablin raised his rifle and saw the shadowy shapes of the others pressing the stocks to their shoulders. The New Zealander took a deep breath and exhaled to signal to his body that the festival of death was about to begin. The first shots caught the Russian sentries off guard, and the shears of the fates began to cut actively. Lifelines were severed as the bullets began to scatter muffled sounds silenced by suppressors. The surprise gave them a quick advance. Abilene threw grenades into the holes where the Russians were hiding, waking some of them just in time to see the hot barrels of the guns send them to eternal sleep. The rifles were aimed into the holes, taking the Russians' lives in the darkness while they were still deciding where to point their weapons. More of the wake-up calls flew through the night, increasing the workload of whatever entities were there to collect the souls of the Russians. At least 12 had already honorably bid farewell to the special operation in Ukraine when the noise awakened other enemies in the night. Turtle and Tai saw through thermal vision that something was wrong. The darkness began to be filled with more and more sources of heat. They appeared from the ground in a position they hadn't seen with the drone. The New Zealanders soon understood. The Russians had dug an extra line of trenches and hidden it among the fallen trees. These men now standing began their shooting. Tai's PKM started firing projectiles, aiming for those small illuminated spots. The sun was rising on the horizon, curious about the scene of death and eager to shed light on new records. The PKN fired as much as it could, but there were too many Russians. Ablin told the men to start retreating. He was shooting when 5.45 millimeters went through his head. Joshua Jones retreated with the other 2 legionnaires. The suppressive fire did little. The sun revealed their positions to the Russians, who hit Jones in the thigh and wounded the others. The American called for help. However, the mortars shattered any hope of rescuing him as he bled profusely. Turtle and Tai felt the same fury coming from the skies. They covered the others' retreat as long as they could until they were forced to fall back to the base to mourn the lost lives. Omwari heard the drone pilot Haring tell how for 2 days the bodies still lay in the trenches before the Russians removed them. After that, there was only the enemy's advance. The Marines of the 155th Russian Brigade and the 40th Naval Brigade had begun their advances. For the reserve, they left the 136th Motorized Rifle Brigade and the 72nd Infantry Division. The advance was steady through the Ukrainian positions. All this force would give them a 4-to-1 advantage in the attack. The typical Russian battalion tactical group was modified into divisions, increasing the amount of infantry accompanying the vehicles for the attacks. TOS-1 made the announcement of the wave of destruction by firing dozens of times at Vuledar. The 8.66 inches escaped from the launchers. There were 30 of these curses of fire every 15 seconds raining down on the Ukrainian bases. B Tier 8 2A and BMP were full of men ready for combat. The snow was falling on the metal, warmed only by the running engines of the armored vehicles. The first phase of the combat would be taking the suburbs covered with trees and country houses. The wooded area would serve as protection if they managed to get past the long covered fields of the plantations. The BMPs released smoke cover, hiding the men's passage during the advance and making it harder for the Ukrainians to fire more accurately at the infantry. Little by little, those riflemen got out and started taking the houses. The first advanced through Ukrainian trenches that almost caught them by surprise. Crouched down, they escaped enemy fire clinging to the frozen ground. They got up slowly and fired without fear. The first man's rifle pointed at the fences and he moved forward, knowing that death could be waiting for him. The training of the elite troops proved superior, pushing back the Ukrainians of the 72nd Brigade and allowing the advance to the houses. The tension put the Russians in a prepared advance, crouching down at every shot they heard, then getting up and running to take the ordered positions. Once the first houses were taken, reinforcements started to come in greater numbers. The houses of the Sumudos belonged to them. Now they kept watching the smoke from the artillery marking the next target. The men could have moved on to Vuhledar to cut off a Ukrainian route, but there was an opening ready within Vuhledar's defenses. The BMP approached with suppressive fire. 100mm and 30mm cannons shattered the bricks of the houses and the Ukrainians who didn't hide in time. The Marines landed in the first houses of the city after the first breach was made. Fighting in an urban environment was never easy. You had to pay attention to the danger coming from above, suppressing men in the windows and letting soldiers enter the houses where the confined environment would be the last day of life for the slower men or those caught by surprise. There was very little space for cover in that small city. The first houses weren't very tall and made the men huddle together, waiting for the moment when the mortars would rain down on the Ukrainians. Each window had the barrel of a rifle, and its interior was decorated with bullet holes. The cold in the air was constantly broken by gunpowder exploding or by artillery that heated human flesh and set houses on fire. The smoke burned above them, setting the houses on fire. The PKMs sang eagerly to provide cover for men trying to turn the corners. The Russian Marines took house by house, carefully entering the rooms, searching for enemies. Their groups moved through the residences, making sure that the ammunition would be well spent to paint the floor with Ukrainian blood. The grenades filled the air with the scent of death, thrown through windows and surprising the defenders. The Russians had already advanced more than 2 kilometers into Vuhledar when the Ukrainians began to reorganize. The invasion lost momentum and the Marines found themselves inside the houses, waiting for the next orders and seeing the memories of families torn apart by the war. Gradually, the forces of the 72nd Brigade took the fight to the Russians instead of just waiting. Constantly bombarded when they stayed still, they realized that a cruel fate awaited them. Turtle and the rest of the foreign reconnaissance platoon received orders for the process of clearing the city. The doctrine of many in his battalion included much more of the bloody battle of close quarters battle than the morbid filth of the trench. New Zealanders, Americans, French, and Germans joined in, watching through the windows in search of Russians. They took the battle to every corner, pushing their rifles in the continuous attempt to bring death to their opponents' bodies. The gunfire gave their comrades time to cross the dangerous streets of Vuledar and walk on to give another chance for some family to shed tears. They held their rifles tightly, suppressing the houses while someone aimed a rocket-propelled grenade at the door. They heard the screams in the midst of the explosion, muffled by the bricks. Afterwards, they entered the devastated places to check the fallen bodies. But of course, it wasn't just the foreigners. They were a minority compared to the effort and anger of the Ukrainians. Alexei Gordeyev was one of those soldiers who stormed one of the houses held by Russians. His squad tried to take the area using grenades to get in. The rifles searched for cracks, fired into the buildings before making sure they could go in. Even so, it was never a certainty. Entering the darkness of a close quarters battle and facing the Russian elite troops was a high risk. They feared not only being taken down by rifles, but also the typical traps the enemies left behind when they decided to retreat. Alexei entered the darkness of the house together with the squad. He was one of the first to go through the icy corridors. The others came behind with the same worried looks. When the shooting started, the chaos took over the rooms, with the intention of leaving those domains only when death appeared. Silence came and
order
prevailed in the presence of the new entity that dominated rooms full of bodies devoid of souls and empty ammunition shells. Thornton knew when Alexei disappeared while searching for the Russians. It was one more friend that the war had taken from him. Ablin, Jones, so many others who had left their bodies on the ground of Ukraine while their spirits went on their way. He sighed the warm air that defied the invincible ice of winter when the next orders came. They needed to drive the Russians out of Vuledar and make the blood of those who had already fallen trying worth it. A soldier never left the war without scars, but he should only stop to be shocked by the horror of those marks on his body or soul after he went home. Inside the combat zone, being overcome by horror was like starting to unravel from yourself the threads of life that tied your spirit to your body. There would still be more about the battles of Vuledar, and the Ukrainians would impose their revenge on the Russians.